and we're gonna go forward. So, I mean, let's just start with short introductions then. So my name is Vytautas Bikauskas. I finished IB more than 3 years ago. I studied IB in Armenia, and I was doing HL, physics, philosophy, and visual arts. And I've been tutoring for over a year. And we're gonna look at an exam report of a machine pupil. Basically, we'll just be looking through the questions, seeing common mistakes for everyone to improve later on, or things that went well, and considering the situation. So basically, I mean, one obvious thing about the student is that they seem to have only worked on a single chapter of the entire syllabus, which is geometry, and they sort of applied the thinking to everything else. So this specific test is split very clearly into two parts. So there's arithmetic and geometry. It's sort of disheartening to see the student attempt to do arithmetic with geometry thinking. But basically, the first question is not too bad, to be honest. So we've got the recognition of several common elements, say the center one and the corners, which is fine, although they're numbers and they're being recognized as an ellipse. So points for trying, and then we've got the central ellipse here, which is not really an ellipse. There's also a lacking cut, which could be seen as a common mistake. And we've got two cuts at the bottom, but they're not really matching to the actual cuts. So the student seems to be getting the pattern right, but not really grasping the idea. I mean, the other obvious thing is this is multiplication. There's no recognition of that in this question or the following questions. I mean, one thing that students sort of starts to recognize as we go forward is that this is complex. They seem to be pointing out that this part of the calculation is rather complex. I mean, that doesn't help the student nor gives points. I mean, it's intuitive, and we still have the same pattern, so that's quite good. The logic is being recognized. Now, at the bottom we have three cuts. That's carrying. It's basically a mistake that's being carried, and that happens quite often in IB questions. Since they build on top of each other, it's a mistake that's being carried from the previous one. And then if we go to the next one, we've got more multiplication, bigger numbers. I mean, and complexity still being recognized. Again, good in that. And then we've got complexity here. So the student is clearly recognizing a pattern. I mean, you can even start thinking maybe they were seeing that this multiplication. I mean, these are large groupings of parts, and we've also got identified cuts on the sides, and they overlap with complex parts. So again, that's overlapping patterns that are clearly identified. And again, we've got the carried mistake, but the third cut is missing. There are some cuts being added. So we could think the student is is recognizing the mistake previously made, or they're just or it's just an overlook. And then if we go to the next one, I mean, it sort of feels like panic, which again happens often in IB exams. Almost everything is recognized as complexity. And well, these are not easy exam questions, really. I mean, this multiplication, quite big numbers. We still have the pattern. Here, we've got an ellipse at the bottom, which is sort of, I think, again, a mistake carried from the very first question. And the cuts are still recognized, and we've got really overlapping complexity. There's no need. I mean, if you're thinking of this, there's no need for you to identify complexity multiple times. Not only doesn't really give you points at the end, but also it's repetitive, and if you're going to grade this, so it's really just panic. I think it's panic mode at this point. And here's just a clear example of sort of the overlap. I mean, it's just more extreme version of the previous. While we can see sort of the similarity, and then the student is possibly identifying that all of these have the equal amount of intersections, since we've got these shapes repeating, and it's really just panic mode again. I mean, complexity is overlapping all over the place. But the geometry part is rather positively surprising. So we can just go through some of the things that worked really well. So here we've got a clearly identified cut. So that's pretty, that's, I mean, and this is nothing in comparison to this, to the fact that the student saw this as a cut. So this is a really, really thin shape. Would be a really common mistake to see this as just two lines intersecting and then not recognize it in the question. But this is clearly a cut. And then we've got another cut here. So that's well identified, and an intersection, which is again, really small shape identified as an intersection. So this is a really promising start. Although if we look at this, actually, that is still an intersection. I actually just made a mistake looking at this. This must be the intersection here that the student identified. And the top one is right here. So again, I mean, this would almost be full points. We've got this one, which is sort of, I mean, it's strange in its reflect, the student seems to have reflected the problem onto itself on the vertical axis. But we've got this identification of a huge cut. Again, that's pretty well identified. The triangle, I mean, the student seems to be attempting to apply right angle trigonometry to this, which is a good starting point for any geometry question. The ellipse is pretty well linked together, and then we've got two cuts at the bottom. So even the tiny ellipse is recognized, so that's pretty well done. And we've got a tiny intersection, which is again incredibly accurate. And then we go on to more complicated questions, and it starts getting a little bit less accurate. So we've only got one cut identified. That's not exactly true. And we've got two intersections. That's well done. We've got an ellipse. And we've got this part, which is really, I mean, you would just lose points for clarity. Really got we've got a right triangle now. Evidently, that is not that. And we've got multiple cuts. Again, you can only see one here, and this is a cut, and then this shape has not been identified as a cut, and there's nothing really repeating, so points being lost here. And then we go on to this one. We've got, I mean, pretty good with the cut here. We've got an ellipse that's sort of cut off, so that's harder to recognize. Again, could be a common mistake, the tiny ellipse being recognized. Now, this student really had a problem with triangles and recognizing triangles when they are overlapping. Now, that being said, they do recognize intersections almost at every point where they happen. So you get points for the intersection. Very rarely do you get points for triangles. I mean, here's one, but what about these three? And then we got a tiny cut identified here, which is again surprisingly well identified. And if we look at the final one where we just see the overlap, again, pretty well done. Although here's, I mean, similar to the arithmetics, there's no need to identify two intersections if we've really only got one. And this is well identified, and this is well identified. The ellipse, again, tiny ellipse matched well. We've got a cut, and this is identified as complexity. Now, that's really just panic, but we're gonna skip, we're gonna sort of overlook that because the other questions in the geometry part were done exceptionally well. And that is the end of the exam.